Research shows that more people use anabolic steroids than heroin. In fact, steroids are becoming some of the most popular drugs out there.
If you add up every cannabis, coke, heroin, you'll have twice as many steroid users.
These changing expectations of the male physique are a factor in the rise in steroid use.
I'm J.S. Raffaeli. I've spent years writing about drugs, why people use them, and why our governments chose to declare war on them. At Vice, we make a lot of films about drugs, but in this show, I get to dig a bit deeper. I get to talk to fellow expert drug nerds about their research into the crazy world of mind-altering substances. Honor Doro Townsend is a criminologist who researches steroid use, especially its connection to social media, the dark web, and how these can drive an obsessive pursuit of perfection. Honor, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So let's get a sense of the numbers here. How many people are using steroids?
So it's a really difficult one to quantify in terms of, actual numbers. In the UK alone, they estimate around, if not more than, 1 million people using steroids of some form regularly. And in the US, it's estimated between 3 and 4 million.
So if we're talking about 1 million people in the UK and like up to 4 million people in the US, that's more popular than heroin.
Yeah, and I mean, again, these are probably quite conservative estimates.
And when we talk about steroids, what are the specific drugs we're actually speaking about?
In this context, we're always talking about anabolic androgenic steroids. There's obviously a variety of steroids, corticosteroids and that kind of thing used in the medical field. But essentially, anabolic means, so in an anabolic state, you are building and maintaining muscle. Steroids don't make you big themselves. They kind of just enable you to work out harder, which will get you bigger. It's not like you inject steroids into your glutes and your glutes grow 2 inches. They're essentially a substance that enable you to work harder and gain that muscle. So if you just took steroids and you didn't go to the gym, nothing's going to happen.
And I guess when a lot of people think about steroids, they are thinking about kind of like elite athletes. But when did steroid use sort of start filtering down into the general population?
Steroid use was sort of popularized within elite athletic communities in sort of the 1950s to 60s. And it was only really in the sort of late 70s, early 80s that started to spread more widely to just a general user population. But that's kind of earlier than I think people would realize. It's probably becoming more and more known about, more and more prevalent because the user stats are just consistently increasing. And you do also have, popular figures who have been quite open about previous anabolic steroid use. Arnie, for instance, which though related to bodybuilding is still slightly different, I'd say, to, the cases like Lance Armstrong, because it's more popularizing the use for muscularity. Rather than for increasing sport performance.
Absolutely. And so when we think about like millions of people using these steroids, they're obviously not all elite athletes. What are like regular people looking for from steroids?
A variety of studies have kind of shown that the most prevalent reason for uptake is to do with aesthetics. Over 50% of people have generally suggested that their use is linked to their body image. Other things are like non-competitive bodybuilding, sport performance, work performance, sex drive, maintaining youth, and also a small population using for sort of self-prescribed hormone replacement therapy. It's a real variety, but I think body image and aesthetic is definitely a main factor, particularly when we're looking at the sort of increasingly young population of young men. Generally talking late teens to mid-20s tends to be a starting point statistically.
Do you think there's a sort of idealized masculine image that people are chasing through using these drugs?
Yeah, I definitely think so. My PhD research is specifically looking at the ties between those idealized forms of masculinities and the use of anabolic steroids. Things such as like performative masculinity, how people are trying to sort of embody, what their belief of what a man should look like, along with social media. These sort of idealized forms of masculinity are created and people try and embody these through their physique. As a society, we've moved away from more of the manual labor of our past, particularly in working class communities. And that can be linked to anabolic steroids, this idea of like embodying historical masculinity. So maybe people feel that increasing their muscularity sort of embodies that work ethic in a lot of ways and sort of harks back to those kind of traditional forms of manhood. There's definitely a population that are just keen on the mass, you know, just as big as possible, as many different muscle groups as possible. But then that's not to say that's the only user group either, because there is a large gay male user group of steroid users, which arguably have different motivators and different sort of rationales.
What's the role played by like social media and maybe even certain reality TV shows in like spreading these images?
I think it's huge. I mean, historically, we've always looked at how social media and the media have an impact on female body image, right? But I don't think the same attention has been paid to male body ideals as of yet. I think we're getting there, but I think there's still this very much like normalized approach to what the male body looks like. And that's not necessarily like super muscular, but it's still definitely defined. Like it's someone that works out, I think is the norm that we're presented. And you've got more and more shows like Love Island that pitch these people, men and women, as everyday normal members of society, as if they're not people who put a lot of effort into their physical appearance. Not that that's a bad thing, but it's not promoting that as the norm. And we're increasingly getting like a younger and younger social media population as well. So these influences are increasingly being sort of drilled into people's heads from a younger and younger age, and more subtly than before. Maybe I think, you know, in a capitalist society, we're all taught to be narcissistic, aren't we? It's, you know, looking out for yourself.
And what are the potential dangers of these drugs? And like, are the rumors true? Do they shrink your penis?
No, they don't shrink your penis. They do shrink your balls. And there is, you know, potential issues relating to fertility based on that, but they don't change the size of a penis. I think one of the most like commonly talked about side effects to do with steroids is going to be aggression, right? But actually there's kind of real difficulty like quantifying that in the academic world. Like, there's definite evidence of like impacts on mental health and mood changes, but I don't think it can be quantified in like a way of just saying roid rage. There's like significant research that shows like heart-related diseases being increased. Also things like liver toxicity, like kidney dysfunction. So there are like major things that can go wrong. I've personally heard stories of people who've gone into gyms and seen lines of 5 or so guys lined up and someone going along and injecting them one by one using the same needle. We promote so much about needle health with other drugs that it's kind of just forgotten about a little bit in steroids. And because of that association with health and fitness, like I don't even know what I'd do if I saw that happening in front of me. Because if guy number 1 in that lineup had a bloodborne virus, every single one of them could have had that thereafter.
Well, actually on that, one of the funny things about steroids is that users often don't think of themselves as drug users. How does that play out in their behavior?
I think the major one is rejecting sort of harm reduction initiatives. So that's stuff like needle exchanges. Like if you're looking at a group of predominantly men who look like the epitome of what we consider healthy, you know, they work out a lot, they eat well, they are low body fat, their BMI is on point, all of those kind of things. And then you say, oh, you know, you need to go to a needle exchange place, same as everyone that uses heroin. I know that some needle exchanges across the UK at least are reporting that the majority of people using their services are steroid users now. But I think there's still this like general reluctance to engage in, kind of healthcare generally. And I think that's partially because of this like stigma and partially because they think they're going to be judged as well by, you know, healthcare professionals. I think generally as well, steroid users maybe feel like healthcare professionals don't get it. They don't understand it. It's not something that they're trained in very often. It's not something that they maybe understand the motivators for. And so I think there's this general perception of like less empathy.
And steroids kind of exist in a legal gray area. Like, what does the market look like? How are people actually getting a hold of this stuff?
So In the UK, they are a category C substance. So that means that they are legal for personal consumption, but they are illegal for sale and distribution. In the US, they're illegal, Australia, Argentina, Brazil, Portugal. There's like more and more countries are legally regulating them, but it is behind, I'd say, on like your classic psychoactive substances. I mean, you hear like about people going to the gym and there's like this guy lurking in a corner and he's like, I've seen you here 3 times this week, like I'm going to give you a bunch of roids. I don't think it's quite like that. I think it's more of a, you know, guys going to a gym regularly and getting in with people who are also interested in the same things as them. I think there might be like one person of that group who, for instance, might buy on the dark web, and they might buy in bulk and sell enough to fund their own use, for instance. That's quite a common thing. And I don't think that's that dissimilar to a lot of other substance use networks. You're not going to get a number for a local dealer, really. There is a lot of dark web involvement. Increasingly as well, there's more sort of underground labs. So people buying the raw ingredients, which predominantly come from China, and then home brewing. A lot of the steroid community will be are like very anti-home brew because a lot of them are very understanding of like the risks associated with that. Quite a lot of social media as well, bodybuilding influencers, in the same way that you might see them promoting like whey protein and that kind of thing. There's like a few that will sort of specify or maybe are sponsored by certain labs. You probably don't see that for heroin.
It's really interesting. Can we talk a bit about superstar bodybuilder influencers on social media and how they affect this scene?
I think one of the most famous would be Rich Piana. He's an American bodybuilder, had a huge social media following. He died in 2017. He was very open about his use online and was one of those kind of like sponsored by various nutrition supplement things. And I'm pretty sure at least at one point sponsored by particular steroid providers. That was a really big one in the community because it was someone who was so open, and because of the association with his death and the steroids, some people are not upfront in the same way that, you know, Lance Armstrong was never upfront about his use of steroids in order for him to be that sort of peak level of cyclist. That's definitely like a risk. But how do you regulate it? Because like you think, okay, ideal world, someone would have to almost put a disclaimer. You know, on Instagram, you have to put like #ads, but you couldn't do like #steroids. You couldn't enforce it, could you? Yeah, dream world, everyone would be upfront about it without fear of, you know, persecution. But I think because of like our drug laws, as much as, you know, personal use is kind of that gray area of legal, because it's not properly legal and regulated, there is still that stigma. And so you can't encourage more openness really whilst those like old out of date drug laws are in place.
We've talked a lot about men, but are women using these drugs as well?
In a much smaller way. The estimates are generally between the user population being between sort of 95 and 98% male. So it is definitely a predominantly male thing. And that will be because, so you know how we said anabolic androgenic steroids. So the androgenic elements generally mean sort of masculinizing. And so because there's these like different ideals on body image, even performance in a lot of cases, as we're seeing more and more with, you know, the sporting difficulties of how do we position transgender people. I think there's perhaps less societal influence, I suppose, encouraging that use in women, but that's not to say it doesn't happen.
What kind of communities are we seeing developing here, either online or IRL? Like, is there something we could talk about as like a steroid scene?
Yeah, a lot of my work has been based on like online communities, a lot on the steroid subreddit. And I think in some ways they're really helpful, really useful, because you have more experienced users explaining cycles and actually kind of like telling a few young guys to not bother. You know, they're saying like, just go to the gym and eat right first. Or they're saying, if you're really going to do it, this is how you should do it. So there is actually quite a lot of good knowledge sharing. But I will say that after spending like 4 months solid in various like online forums, for predominantly like bodybuilding forums, I try not to end up biased, but there's a lot of toxic masculinity, being like outright homophobic, and using really derogatory language. There was also like a real sexualization of women generally, as well as the few female forum users that there were. So that was just stuff like if they ever posted a picture of themselves having worked out, it would be inundated with a bunch of the forum bros saying like, I want to see you naked, text me on this number. And so that kind of thing. And also there was like a huge population of conspiracy theorists. There was a lot of anti-vax, anti-mask, anti-government, general rhetoric and loads of conspiracy stuff. And I've read at least 2 threads on various forums about alien encounters. So I don't know what it's about, but there's definitely something to unpick there.
It's funny, that was literally going to be my next question. It's like, is there a crossover between those like steroid Reddits and anti-vax and like more politically right-wing Reddits? Like, does this tie in with a kind of the right-wing body kind of ideal?
Yeah, it kind of does. And I think it goes back to all the way at the beginning when we were talking about those sort of traditional masculinities and had that sort of an influence. And I think there is this link between that sort of traditional approach to masculinity. There was sexism, there was homophobia, there was racism, all intermixed within these forums, when you kind of expect these forums to literally just be places to talk about, you know, diet, fitness, cycles. And that's not what the case was in my experience. I think my interpretation of that would be that the sort of striving for that traditional masculine image, when I asked about how people who self-identified as using steroids, how they viewed masculinity and what, you know, masculinity means to them, some of my survey participants not only said about muscularity, but also said about you know, being a provider, being head of the household, earning the most money, you know, all of these like very traditional ideals.
And are there specific issues around steroid use in the LGBT community?
Gay men have been shown to score more highly than heterosexual men on all measures of like disordered eating, and also more highly on like a drive for muscularity. And I thought that was really interesting because that may be even more of an issue within the gay male community. It kind of stems down to like, whose gaze are you doing it for? You know, I think a lot of heterosexual men might start at the gym as a way to attract women. That's a big thing that people say. But I think increasingly, like the more muscular you get, that becomes less of like a motivator. I think it becomes more and more about competition and approval from kind of the male gaze.
Is this part of a general trend of men and people generally just like pushing their bodies to like more and more extremes?
Yeah, I mean, I think like as a society, we're getting more and more extreme in a lot of ways, right? I did see this wild case though of this guy somewhere in Eastern Europe who injected like oil into his arms to increase muscle size, but not actual muscle size, but just like the appearance of muscles. So he had like these tiny little skinny arms and these just huge bulges of oil. The one thing that's talked quite a lot about is body dysmorphic disorder. Despite increasing in size and in muscularity, these men don't see themselves getting bigger. And so they constantly think that they are smaller than they are, and they're self-conscious about it. In the same way, you know, body dysmorphic disorder is applied to anorexic people with anorexia who, you know, don't see themselves as skinny despite categorically being skinny and underweight.
What can like users and I guess us as a society do to like not stigmatize this sort of drug use, but to like mitigate the dangers and make it more safe?
Under like our current laws and regulations. So as we currently are, then yeah, stuff like needle exchanges, increasing education. If we really, really want to change the state of play with these drugs, same with any drugs, if we, you know, legalized and regulated, then a lot of the risks are going to be mitigated.